Hello. So welcome, and thank you very much indeed for coming. I know that as ever in the Northeast, there's a huge competition for your cultural attention tonight. I know that there's the Durham Book Festival. I know that there's Eliza Carthy at the Sage Gateshead. And I know that there is Benedict Cumberbatch being live streamed from the Tyneside Cinema in Hamlet. And I know that that's sold out, so don't leave now. But I know that you haven't made a silly decision, because here is a fantastic panel of speakers. It's going to be a fantastic evening as we talk about the challenge of change. So my name is Matthew Grenby. I am director of the new Newcastle University Humanities Research Institute. That's NURI. And you're going to hear a little bit more from me in a second about this evening. But just before I say those things, I have two jobs to do. One is to say that this evening, this event is being live streamed. So you will be able to watch this later, should you so choose. And when we come to questions, because we want this to be a debate, you should wait for the microphone before you ask a question. That's important, so it will be captured on the live stream. Another thing I can tell you is that you're very, very welcome to tweet, if you like, about this. There's free Wi-Fi, which you should be able to find, and our hashtags, hashtag AHRC10, hashtag challengeofchange are there, should you wish to use them. And the last thing I have to do just for now is to introduce our introducer. Now, the Vice-Chancellor, Chris Brink of Newcastle University, was going to be here, but I'm afraid he's poorly. So in his stead, we have Professor Julie Sanders, who is a Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Newcastle. And we're very grateful for her for agreeing to open this debate with a few words now. Thank you, Julie.
So, good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'd like to welcome you to an event which is doing double duty as the second of a series of national debates to mark the 10th anniversary of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and secondly, the launch of the Newcastle University Humanities Research Institute, NURI, and as a brand new Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, that's an especially proud moment for me. The AHRC is the UK Research Council that distributes over £100 million per year to support research in the arts and humanities. This includes many world-class projects here at Newcastle University, ranging across disciplines, from the Creative Exchange, a major investment to bring creative sector businesses and academics together to explore the possibilities of the digital public space, to the Newcastle Poetry Festival, which took place earlier this year to mark the culmination of our AHRC-funded Poetics of the Archive project. We are delighted also to be part with Durham and Queen's University Belfast of the AHRC's Northern Bridge Doctoral Training Partnership, which funds over 50 studentships per year to outstanding postgraduate researchers in arts and humanities subjects. The AHRC 10th anniversary debates are taking place this year and next across the UK and indeed in the United States of America. With the overarching theme of the way we live now, the debates have been designed to examine key aspects of our lives and in particular to explore the ways in which the arts and humanities can help us understand a changing world. We are delighted that Newcastle University was chosen to host one of these debates. The first debate at the British Museum looked at how we curate the nation. The next, at Cambridge University, will look at faith and education. Our theme tonight is change, a topic inspired by the speech given by Dr. Martin Luther King almost 50 years ago when he spoke to accept an honorary doctorate of civil law bestowed upon him by Newcastle University. Dr. King spoke of three urgent and indeed great problems faced by the world: the problem of racism, the problem of poverty, and the problem of war. It was 1967, and we may want to reflect on how much has changed since then, but also how little in America, in Britain, in South Africa, throughout the world. Some of the biggest changes we've witnessed in the last 50 years have been made by scientists and engineers, entrepreneurs and inventors, leaders and legislators. To discern and to understand those changes, we need different skills. We need the skills of historians, of geographers, of philosophers, of linguists, of lawyers, theorists, and critics. And we need the work of creative practitioners too, For who is better able to show us change, to help us to comprehend it than artists, musicians, and writers? In short, then, we need the arts and the humanities, disciplines that make human culture and study it, that explore the human experience across time and across place. The humanities foster our critical thinking and skepticism, our ability to communicate and our empathy, and they show us not only how we live now, but also how we have become what we are and how we can make ourselves better. And I should say that as part of preparations to mark the Martin Luther King honorary doctorate, we are in the middle of a major restoration project of our historic Armstrong building. And just last week, a copy of University's Quarterly from 1948 was found in the King's Hall by the building workers, and they brought it to me. And I'm very glad to say that alongside adverts for sherry and Euthymol toothpaste, on page 497 there is the start of an article called "The Nature and Justification of an Arts Education." And it asks, why study the humanities? In short, its answers stem from awareness, vocation, understanding, to usefulness. And it will be very interesting to see tonight where we have moved in that debate. So I am very pleased today to be launching the Newcastle University Humanities Research Institute, founded to catalyse, coordinate and support research in the humanities at Newcastle and to promote the humanities both within and beyond the university. Newcastle is famous as a city of industry, technology, mining and medicine, but it also has a very proud history of innovation in the humanities. The Literary and Philosophical Society, established in 1793, the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne, founded in 1813. And the university continues this tradition with my humanities colleagues undertaking world-class research in fields as various as city futures and children's literature, heritage studies and film, archaeology and digital civics. Our humanities researchers have long worked in partnership with organisations beyond the university, including museums and theatres, local government and businesses, as well as in communities. And NURI will be absolutely central to the ongoing development of this work, helping us to deliver on our mission to be a world-class civic university and to play a leading role in the economic, social and cultural development of the northeast of England. So once again then, let me welcome you to this launch for NURI and to this debate on the challenge of change. Please enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much indeed. So this is how it's going to work today. There's going to be me for about 5 or 10 minutes, I'm afraid. I just want to introduce the subject of our discussion, which is going to be change. Then I'm going to ask each of our speakers, going from your right to your left, to speak for just 5 or 10 minutes each, if that's okay. I've slightly tricked them. I told them this is going to be tremendously informal. I didn't tell them there was going to be a lectern, so I've given them the option. They can use the lectern, they can sit there, but after they've all spoken, that's when we throw it open to you, and we hope that there'll be a full, thorough, pugnacious discussion about the nature of change. So that's our theme, the challenge of change. And of course, change means loads of different things to loads of different people. There's social change, climate change, democratic change, regime change. There's personal change, growing up, moving away, becoming someone new. There are all sorts of different kinds of change. I think the word is from the Latin cambere, to exchange, or to barter. To get something new, you have to give something up. You can upgrade, but you might lose the things you're used to. And we can deplore change as much as we desire it. We can work for it, but we can fear it. Complicated stuff. That's why, in the run-up to this debate, we asked a lot of people what they think about change. And I'm just going to speak for 5 minutes now to introduce you to what they told us. So first of all, we ran a Challenge of Change campaign here around the university and through social media way beyond. So people's responses to the questions we asked have been displayed on plasma screens all around the campus for the last couple of weeks, and you may, if you have very good eyesight, have seen some of them up here on the screen as you were coming in. There have been loads of very, very interesting responses. People are amazed about the effect of digital technology on our lives. They are applauding a society's much greater toleration for difference. But there's also deep, deep concern about food poverty, environmental collapse, social injustice, the erosion of altruism, and someone, I don't know if you saw, in Norway, who's still very, very resentful about the way that the chocolate bar changed its name from Marathon to Snickers. I researched that. That was 1990. So if you're under about the age of 35, you might just have to ask your mum and dad about that. Second, we were in partnership with the Newcastle Journal, the local newspaper here, and they ran a campaign asking people what they felt about change. And that was a wonderful list. I don't know if you saw it, but people came up with all sorts of things. Shops are open on Sundays. Fewer than ever people go to church. More people than ever live on their own. No more jobs for life. All foreign players in your local football team. Contraceptives, IVF, feminism, gay marriage, EU, bottled water, the surveillance state, people wearing jeans into middle age. Lots of different changes that people are deserved. And the third thing was that the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, they commissioned YouGov to do a poll on the nature of change, people's attitudes to change. That was very interesting, hugely detailed. I was amazed when I saw the kind of level of detail that you get. I can tell you, for instance, that the people who most want society to change are male, 18 to 24, from Scotland or London, either students or unemployed, either never married or with 3 or more children in their house. They're all users of Twitter, but not Facebook. The interesting thing, though, the headline, I think, was that when we conducted this campaign in the university, when we asked around the university with our Challenge of Change campaign, 88% of people, a huge majority, said that change was not moving fast enough. Well, that they were either happy with the pace of change or that it wasn't moving fast enough. That contrasts quite markedly, actually, with what the Journal found, and indeed with what the AHRC's polling found. There, a huge majority, and particularly large amongst the over 55s, were thinking that change has gone far too fast. And I don't know if you saw the paper this morning. There's a very good picture of you, Philippa. Most of us think that change is happening too fast and too often, was the headline that they come up with. So there are different views of how to respond to the pace of change in our society. Now, where the polls agreed was that the most significant changes that we've had in our lifetimes, in the last 50 years, the most significant changes were in technology, science and medicine, and then a little way below those, population and migration, civil rights. No one, incidentally, had anything to say about political change or economic change. They don't even register. So there was that agreement. Also, there was agreement when we asked who should lead change. Who should lead change? The overwhelming majority of people said, us. Ordinary people are the people who are best qualified to lead change. Now, what was really interesting, though, for our purposes today, was who should understand change. Who's best equipped to understand change? The top categories are here. Top, journalists, like Emma. Second, writers, like Philippa and Lem. And third, well, let's call it fourth, actually, was historians. Historians, and a little way beyond that, actually philosophers as well. So these are the people who the public, who we think are best qualified to understand change. And I took a lot of encouragement from that. We're just setting up this new Humanities Research Institute. So, of course, I'm delighted to find that we have a role, understanding change. On the other hand, then I thought, perhaps that makes us a bit useless. Perhaps we can only understand it, perhaps we can't make it. Karl Marx, remember him? I think he would have agreed. If you go to his gravestone in London, you will find these words. The philosophers, he said, I think he'd include historians and other humanities people, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. Our point, however, is to change it. Well, that's tricky. But maybe, and this is one of the things that I hope we can explore today, maybe in order to change the world, you have to understand it, you have to describe it, you have to write it. So that's one of the things I'll be asking our panel, and I hope that you might want to engage with as we come on to the discussion. All of our speakers, I'm going to introduce them one by one now, all at the beginning, all of our speakers are people who have used the power of the arts and humanities to influence our world. First of all, this is David Armitage. He was born and educated in Stockport. He studied English as an undergraduate, but switched midway through his PhD to history. And following a stint at Princeton, he gained his doctorate at Cambridge. He then went to Columbia University in New York, then Harvard, and that's where he is now as Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Harvard. His books include The Ideological Origins of the British Empire, The Declaration of Independence, A Global History, Foundations of Modern International Thought, and coming out next year, what could be more relevant than this? Civil War, A History in Ideas. A history of civil war that goes all the way from ancient times to Syria today. His book from last year was The History Manifesto, co-authored with Joe Gouldy. A book which urges historians, says that historians absolutely must use their art to influence politicians. And Cambridge University Press, who published it, think that's so important that they made it available as a free download, as a Creative Commons license. So you can go to their website and download it, or you can go to the bookstore outside and buy a copy in hard copy, which obviously you will want to do. Now, exactly like David, Philippa Gregory switched from English to history, an English to history degree, and following a stint at the BBC, she wrote a PhD in 18th century literature at Edinburgh. At the same time, somehow, she was writing her first novel, Wideacre, a story of an independent 18th century woman caged by the expectations of a male-dominated world, but determined that it was not she, but, and I quote, the world that would have to change. Her historical novels do certainly have some bodices being ripped. You probably think rather unfairly of her Hollywood, her Other Boleyn Girl, which was given that Hollywood blockbuster treatment. But strong women fighting for autonomy is a constant theme, and she unflinchingly tackles difficult issues in her novels. Slavery, patriarchy, abuse of power, incest, marginality. And it's a resolve that characterises her charitable campaigns too. Gardens for the Gambia, and lobbying for support of the Chagos Islanders in their struggle against British injustice. Then we come to Emma Tucker, who also had a very interesting education, going from the local comprehensive in Sussex to, at her own insistence, sixth form in Las Vegas, New Mexico. From there, she went on to read PPE at Oxford, slightly later, I'm guessing, than David Cameron, so we can't necessarily ask you, I think we have to resist the opportunity to ask you whether his now notorious student days.
We were contemporaries, and I have absolutely no recollection of him whatsoever.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to tell us that he hadn't changed at all. She's been a journalist for 20 years. She spent a decade as foreign correspondent in Brussels and in Berlin before becoming what she's now deputy editor of The Times a couple of years ago. And finally, this is Lem Sisse. He first self-published his first book of poetry at 18. Our own local Blood Axe Books published his Rebel Without Applause in 1992, and he hasn't looked back. Collections of verse, children's books, plays, radio scripts, documentaries, plus those poems in the world for which he's so well known. Poems written into buildings, carved in stone, up on the display screens at the FA Cup final, and of course he was official poet of the 2012 London Olympics. So you'll have heard him on Desert Island Discs on Sunday. Repeated tomorrow?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
9 o'clock. And so I won't go into
It's not as good the second time.
Well, I think it'll be even better. And I won't tell you too much about his extraordinary childhood, but I have to give a couple of headlines. His Ethiopian mother coming to Britain to study, not knowing she was pregnant, asking that Lem be fostered briefly, and then that somehow turning into an adoption, and then an adolescence spent in a variety of children's homes. And if you want to know more, then that potted, well, perhaps you'll talk about it later, I don't know, but if you want to know more, Friday, tomorrow, 9 o'clock. His MBE was for services to literature, and only yesterday you will have heard he was installed as Chancellor of Manchester University. Elected, it has to be said, against one of our own local ex-MPs. But since that local ex-MP was Peter Mandelson, perhaps we will forgive that kind of regional slight. So I wouldn't, there's a lot of rivalry between us cities of the northern powerhouse, of course, you know, Newcastle, Manchester, so I wouldn't normally quote Disraeli saying, You know, what happens in Manchester today happens in the rest of the world tomorrow. But then again, here you are in a university setting addressing a big hall of people, so it does actually seem kind of true on this particular occasion. So that's our distinguished panel. I've asked them all to speak for a few minutes. We'll go from David first through to Lem, and then it's up to you to continue the debate. Thank you very much indeed.
Loose change, small change, step change, sea change, exchange, sex change, a change of pace, a change of heart, change ringers, change agents, the change of life, climate change. Change is in the air, all around us, on our minds, under our skin. It seems unavoidable, inevitable, even enjoyable, but sometimes upsetting, unsettling, or liberating and invigorating. We're told to live with change, to embrace change, to seek change, to face change. But how has change, well, changed? Would knowing something about the history of change help us to face the challenge of change, here and now, in the present, and onward into the future? Answers to those questions might be one good reason to have a humble historian on our panel this evening. But of course, I'm also part of the Mancunian fifth column that's taking over here as well, along with Lem. This was all prearranged. To everything there is a season. Turn, turn, turn. Decline and fall, the ascent of man and woman, the descent of man, mostly man descending. Our Western heritage, to go no further, is packed with metaphors of metamorphosis. Till the last half millennium or so, most Western means of understanding change implied cycles. What's born must die, what develops will corrupt, but from the ashes may arise a phoenix. From the mulch of collapse springs the seed of growth. When time stretched out to a longer horizon with the advent of geological timescales and evolutionary schemes in the 18th and 19th centuries, change became at the same time slower and more fundamental, but almost immediately in disturbing ways, seemingly faster and more threatening. As time burst beyond biblical proportions, the age of the earth dramatically deepened, change itself changed from something seemingly short-term, narrow gauge and providential to something long-term, broad-based and open-ended, no longer reassuringly directed, but seemingly directionless, haphazard and experimental. Think of Charles Darwin's epochal understandings of the adaptive mechanisms of natural selection, a vision of evolution, not of revolution, the tangled bank, as Darwin beautifully called it, rather than the maker's hand. Here's another vision of change. See if you can guess where this comes from. A change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. It makes its pathway over and under the sea, as well as on the earth. It makes its wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. I did that yesterday morning, so I can confirm that. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. The far-off and almost fabulous Pacific rolls in grandeur at our feet. China, the mystery of the ages, is being solved. Was that written 6 months ago? No. This is from 1852, July 1852. The majestic words of the former slave, Frederick Douglass. He knew change, personal change, and he knew massive, fundamental societal change. Writing just 7 years before Darwin published his Origin of Species, giving us a vision of what we now call globalization. Douglass called that annihilation, the annihilation of space, the annihilation of time, over 150 years ago. Douglass and many of his contemporaries apprehended, and indeed often celebrated, this space-time compression, as sociologists called it, well over a century before the internet, or for that matter, before EasyJet. Change itself has hardly changed, but our attitudes towards change certainly have. Again, Darwin depicted organisms adapting to their environments. Humans have adapted to change by understanding it in similar ways, more complex, yes, even more challenging, to take the title of this debate. But thinking of change as a challenge makes it sound more like an ordeal, a trial to be faced, maybe a victory to be won, or perhaps a defeat to be suffered against the force of change. But maybe not an innovation to be pursued, a new path to be followed. One great discovery, if we go back a little bit in time to the 18th century, was the discovery by the Enlightenment of what we call unintended consequences. Adam Smith's invisible hand is the most famous version of that, and he used that initially to describe the hand of God turning the heavens, but in the end it became the hand of the economy, the way in which cumulative operations worked behind the backs of individuals to make trends and enormous long-term changes. That's the kind of world that we imagine now when we think of change. Our individual efforts accumulating and somehow getting out of our control, becoming unintended consequences, even as we try and wrestle that control back. The heirs of Adam Smith and his contemporaries, the contemporary social sciences, have tried to expose the invisible hand to show its workings in the economy and politics and the global environment, with much success, but have also left a lot of remaining mystery. And here's where the humanities can come in. Knowledge is power, as Francis Bacon famously said, knowing that, for instance, foreign aid can hurt as well as help in some societies, learning that capitalism accelerates inequality rather than abolishing it, as we hoped some years ago, discovering that smoking causes lung cancer, industrial emissions heat the atmosphere, and that those discoveries were covered up by corporations for decades. These are all important ways to help us uncover change, to face up to it, but also maybe to realize how all of these changes relate to each other, how they're all connected with each other by invisible hands which make not light work for humans, but very hard work for humans, for animals, for the environment of which we all part. Here's where the humanities in general and the historians can come in. 14% of the British population thought historians were the best people to understand change. Go historians, I say. Most of those who study the world around us, at least professionally in history departments, work on short biological timescales, approximating the length of a human life. This only confirms, I fear, the short-termism of our times, hemmed in by quarterly reports, annual evaluations, and the miserable confines of election cycles around the world. Historians, however, are time lords and time ladies, trained to unravel complexity from the historical record, but now inclined to do so over longer timescales of centuries, even millennia. In an era of big data, historians can be among the big debaters, tracking change across sweeps of time and space unimaginable and unimagined by most economists or political scientists, let alone financiers or politicians. As one historian, winner of a Nobel Prize for Literature no less, remarked, the longer you can look back, the further you can look forward. That was Winston Churchill, by the way. History may hold one key to the challenge of change by helping us to see the knotted roots of our own tangled bank, the multiple causes and many culprits of our current discontents, from climate change and growing gaps of wealth within nations, even as the abysses close between nations in terms of the differences in relative wealth between them, all the way to, say, the crisis of the nation state, the refugee crisis that's going on around us now. These contemporary challenges all have complex histories and deep roots, and not just complex, but interconnected. The West's systematic underdevelopment of the rest, the export of the nation-state, bordered and bounded, sovereign and territorial to much of the world, failed states breeding stale fates for not just hundreds of thousands, but now millions of displaced people. All of this heaps change upon change for every uprooted refugee, of course, but also in the aggregate for our states that fail in their political imagination and indeed their ethical duty to open their frontiers and their hearts to the wretched of the earth. And if we think all that's a challenge, wait till things really change in the next couple of generations. Small islands in the Pacific sinking beneath the waves and in the Indian Ocean are already tipping us off about the next great challenge, the challenge of climate change. The next wave of refugees will probably be climate refugees, and they'll form a tsunami compared to the streams, even the rivers now washing up on the shores of the global north. They'll head from their homes to the temperate zones, demanding food, water, welfare, an open world as they prick the conscience of our first world. How will we respond to the greatest challenge of all, the challenge of climate change? That's a question for all our futures that needs some answers right here and right now. That's our challenge, not one for our grandchildren or our grandchildren pushed off into other generations to face all on their own. It's our challenge. Plus ça change? No. All change? Very definitely.
fantastic start to the debate. Completely overwhelmed. Part of the reason for that is because I was informed on very good authority that this was going to be informal, that there were to be no notes, that we were to just stroll up and speak, as it were, from our hearts. So fortunately, I took that with as much seriousness as anybody would take it, and I did a bit of a Google. So I did a bit of a Google on change, and there's a whole section of quotes on change, and I am appalled to say they are all overwhelmingly enthusiastic. They go on and on and on about how great change is, how about we march into the future, how about how wonderful it is, and the ones that are at all negative about change really stress that we personally should change. Because then you get into the cosmopolitan fix-yourself mode, in which everybody has got to change all the time, constantly, till they reach some kind of perfection, which will itself, of course, be in a state of constant flux. People are mad for change, and I am here to tell you it is horrible. It is. Your babies, your adorable babies, grow up and become incredibly expensive teenagers. My own husband was settling into a plump, comfortable, soothing middle age and has suddenly got a bike and is going around like a fevered whippet. Is slimmer than I have ever seen him before and is so energetic that I'm exhausted. I had to come out to talk to you this evening rather than be at home with him doing press-ups. David is very right to tell us to look at change. He's written this wonderful history manifesto where he uses the phrase, the longue durée. I love a bit of French in a paper. I think it gives it such sophistication. The longue durée, by which I think you mean the long view. Yeah, the long view, okay. Well, here in England, we tend to think of ourselves as a conservative country. We go mad, of course, every 4 years and try and demonstrate that we mean that. But even outside those times of insane choices, we do tend to think of ourselves as people who don't seek change, who like things to be pretty steady state. This has been true, except for after the war, when we were known throughout the world as a nation of change and novelty, where we enjoyed a society which called itself a world turned upside down. That's after the English Civil War, of course, because that's the sort of length of time we're looking at here. So I thought the most important thing now was to really consult and to consider what David Bowie says. As you know, what David Bowie says is changes, turn and face the strange. Changes, don't want to be a richer man. Changes, just going to turn and face the change. Changes, just going to have to be a different man. Time may change me, but I can't trace time. And so that you're certain that that's the message of the song, he repeats it helpfully. He says, I said that time may change me, but I can't trace time. I have no idea what that means. It is good though. But history, I do know, absolutely loves change. You read any history book, it is a record of the changes that happened. And that is why history is such a fascinating study, why it's so fascinating to write, why it's so fascinating to read, because it's genuinely a page-turner. There is event, and then there are reverses, and then there is progress, and then there is something else. It's about opportunity. But the reason that I write historical fiction rather than writing history is because historical fiction tells you about the things that history does not observe. By and large, actually, history doesn't observe women very much, because up until about the 1920s, there were no women trained academic historians, and so there was nobody consulting the needs and the actions and the conspiracies sometimes of their own gender. But also, history doesn't talk about women very much because it used to be very much military history, and it used to be very much political history. And women banned from the army until relatively recently, and without the vote until relatively recently, were not active in the areas that historians were interested in. Now, of course, with the rise of women into power, into activity, we do see, and also with the change of history itself into more social history and a more general history of society, we can see more women both entering into the discipline, into the study, and into the histories themselves. But the other thing that history doesn't do that historical fiction does do is it looks at things, historical fiction can look at things that didn't happen or that weren't significant when you look back. History is absolutely cursed with hindsight, which is why you'll see, those of you who know my work, I write all my novels in first person, present tense. And that means that every time a character approaches a change or the society approaches a change or an opportunity, the reader is there and participating in the decision. And you don't know, ideally, what the decision is going to come to. Historians tell you what happened. What they can't tell you is all of the things that might have happened, all of the things that failed, all of the ideas that people didn't quite bother with. And that's why I love writing historical fiction, because the other thing that it can tell you as well is it tells you the inner story, the psychology, which I think novels are fundamentally about the change of the protagonist, or the change of the hero, or the change of a character, or the change in a narrator, that's what the novel does. And that's why I would rather write novels than actually write history. It's why I love to write historical fiction, because you're looking at change from the inside as it's happening, with all of the freshness and danger of it, and with none of the sense of this has been done and decided. I love so much the present tense that I have used it in almost every novel since I started writing fictional biographies. And when I wrote The Other Berlin Girl, one of the first readers said to me, I couldn't put it down because I couldn't wait to know what would happen to Anne Boleyn. And I'd say, really, you do know what happens to Anne Boleyn. But the problem of the spoiler is exactly the joy of writing historical fiction. History doesn't see the defeated. History doesn't see the lost causes. And of course, it is cursed with hindsight. It sees all the opportunities ultimately as equal, and then it just judges the one that comes off right, the one that wins. So it's always, ultimately, it's the history of the victors. And so when it reports change, it doesn't report the multiplicity of opportunities. What we have to remember is that everybody who ended up choosing, if indeed they chose, I would argue they didn't, but anyone who ended up choosing the Tudors do not, in a sense, look back as we do and go like, it's going to be great. We're going to get television out of it, we're going to get novels out of it, we're going to get a living out of it for a lifetime. At the time, they didn't know that it was going to be a good idea at all. And indeed, many of them, right the way through to Elizabeth I, thought it had been a thorough mistake. In a sense, you can't get the reflection of that from the history. What we have to do when we look at the changes that face us now is realize that historical change looks easy. It's much, much harder when you're living in the moment. I don't even know if I like change. I said at the beginning that personally, I don't find it an engaging challenge. I find it at times a complete nuisance. There are some things that I know I don't like very much. I'm sure you could all compile a massive list of modern things that we don't like. I would like to offer you only two from my own incredibly lengthy list. One would be the word soz, which fundamentally means I'm not sorry at all. And the other would be these things, I don't know if you're so hip here that you use emoticons. You don't know what to say, you don't know how to say it to convey the emotion that you have, so you put a little smiley face on the end of it. And the person who's receiving this garbage is supposed to go, oh, a little smiley face. I tell you what, I'll send a little puzzled face back. Unfortunately, there isn't one which says, you are illiterate. If you are going to write to me with words. I am not interested in little stickers because I am out of primary school now. But no. But there are some things that do not change and have not changed, and thank God for them. And I am just going to offer a few of them to you this evening. But celebrate with me the long, powerful history of the condom, which was invented in the Minoan dynasty at 150 AD and is still with us, virtually unchanged, except for some tiny technical improvements today. And that's a wonderful thing. Celebrate with me, take to your heart, bubble wrap. Invented as wallpaper for really, really trendy people. And there were not enough trendy people to make it worth the production. So they said, hang on a minute, we could wrap things in it. That would be great. And there you have it. Celebrate with me Ole Kirk Kristofferson, who in 1949 invented Lego. unchanged today, except I'm very fond of Duplo myself, which I find easier. But fundamentally, the principle is still wonderfully the same. And I would like to conclude completely with the teapot. Yuan dynasty, 1279, a beautiful object, perfectly formed for its function, unchanged, probably in every single home that is here represented today, unchanged from when it was invented in China. Thank you.
Right, well, David, Philippa, you've both spoken very eloquently, but very generally about change. And since I'm neither a historian, nor a poet, nor a novelist, but a hack, I thought when I was told to talk about change, the best thing I could do was to talk about a very specific change, which is the monumental change that my industry is currently living through. And when Matthew said journalists came out as being the best place to understand change, I did wonder whether that's because we ourselves are living and breathing it from day to day at the moment and wondering how, where we're all going to come out at the end. So I thought I'd start by saying, in January this year, my newspaper, The Times, celebrated its 230th birthday, making it one of the oldest newspapers in the world, certainly in Britain and partly in the world as well. Now, in that time, the Times it's reported and commented on the issues of the day. It's been at home, abroad, war and peace. It's covered economic crises, royal scandals. It's broken scoops. It's uncovered malpractice. It's waged campaigns, and it's held those in power to account. We were on the ground during the Crimean War. We were there at the bombing of Guernica. We covered 2 world wars. We were there when Everest was conquered. And we were with Howard Carter when Tutankhamun's tomb was opened. Now, for the first 223 of those 230 years, how we delivered the news didn't really change very much. And the same can be said of the business model that we used to fund the delivery of that news. So in a nutshell, how did we deliver news? Well, reporters went out into the field, gathered news stories, filed them back to base by a deadline where an editor and a sub-editor knocked them into shape, the printers rolled, and the paper was available to purchase the next day. The business model was almost equally uncomplicated. There were 2 streams of revenue: advertising, which you printed in the newspaper, and up until 1966, the entire front page of the Times newspaper was all adverts, and purchases at the newsstand. 2 revenue streams. If you could get more in from them than you spent sending out your reporters, then you were in business. Now, as I said, for the first 223 years, that's pretty much how it operated, right up to and including the point at which I entered the industry, which was as a graduate trainee for the Financial Times in 1990. And I did my thing there. I went abroad and I carried on filing to deadline for a print product up until 2007, when I joined the Times. Now, that wasn't even 10 years ago, but when I joined the Times, I remember there was a department on the paper called Online. And Online was in a separate floor of the building, and nobody wanted to work there. It was where you went if you weren't very successful. Little did we know what was about to hit us, and hit us it did. Along came the digital revolution, which blew apart everything we took for granted as a newspaper. And none of us realized the extent to which it was going to change our world. So what do I mean by that? Well, for a start, we had to look at our very own product and ask ourselves, what is a newspaper? Well, 10 years ago, the editor of the Times, he only really had to worry about one thing, which was the newspaper. Today, he has to worry about the newspaper, the website, the app, the smartphone app, the podcasts that go out in our names, and all these other digital platforms. And to be perfectly honest, it's actually impossible to keep across all of them. So our very idea of what a newspaper is has changed beyond recognition. Secondly, our competition has changed. 10 years ago, we only really had to worry about the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, the Independent, to some extent the Financial Times, and maybe the Daily Mail. Now we have to worry about all those other print newspapers and their websites, but we also have to compete against Facebook, Twitter, Apple News, Google News, Mail Online, WhatsApp News, BBC News website, Vice, Quartz, BuzzFeed, Politico, and so on and so on. So the competition for eyeballs, as they like to put it, is intense. Secondly, so first of all, our very idea of what a newspaper is has changed beyond all recognition. What does that actually mean for the journalists? Well, in the old days, it was all about deadlines. You filed your story, you filed to a deadline, and you went home until the next day when you got up and went to see what had happened to your story. These days, you might file for a deadline for the print product, but the news doesn't stop. So these days, journalists have to keep an eye on their stories the whole time. You might file for the newspaper, but then if a story keeps on breaking, you have to file again for the website. You might have to file for the app, which doesn't get completed till 3:30 in the morning. When you get up in the morning, you'll be asked to update your story again. So the whole concept of where news begins and ends has changed as well. You're no longer just a byline, you're a Twitter handle. You might have to run a blog. You might even have your own website. You have to be out there engaging with the world. You're not just a byline in a newspaper anymore. We also have to contend with citizen journalists. You're all citizens journalists. Everybody is a journalist now. How do the professional journalists, the ones who've worked for old media, compete with people with an iPhone and a camera who spot something, film it, stick it up on a website, and before you know it, it's gone viral? Where do we fit in this new era of citizen journalism? So, last, and perhaps the hardest thing of all for newspapers to have to deal with is the business model. So the old revenue streams that I mentioned before, advertising and newsstand sales, they're no longer guaranteed. We live in a world where certainly younger people don't expect to have to pay for their news. So newspapers are having to ask themselves, well, what do we do? Do we put our content up for free, or do we ask people to pay for it? Now, no one has actually come up with the answer yet, which is why it all feels so febrile in the world that I'm in at the moment. But two models are emerging, and they couldn't really be more different. At one end of the spectrum, you have the free model, and in that camp, you could put The Guardian and the Mail Online. Their view is information wants to be free, it's out there, you read it, you don't pay anything to read it, it's all funded by advertising. There are two problems with that. One is the revenue streams from advertising on digital don't come anywhere near the streams we used to get for print advertising. And in fact, most newspapers still make more money out of print advertising than they do from digital. Even the Mail Online, they get more money from their print advertising, the Daily Mail, than they get from Mail Online, which is the most successful website in the world, or the second most successful website. So there's that problem. The other problem is, recently, they're having to contend with ad blockers. So people are beginning to install ad blockers on as software in the computers which stop the ads popping up on their screen. Now, that's a real problem if your model is funded by ads. So recently, I found out, I was listening to a man from Bild newspaper, which is Germany's most successful tabloid. They're trying to beat the ad blockers by installing their own software, which says to people who install ad blockers, you've installed an ad blocker, either take it off or you have to pay to read our newspaper. But you can't expect to have this absolutely for free. So there's a real challenge there. In the other camp, the other spectrum, the other model that's emerging, you would put us, me, the Times, the Economist, the Financial Times, the New York Times, and we've developed the paywall system, which I know is very unpopular because but our basic message is you have to pay to read our journalism. If you want us to invest in our journalism, you're going to have to pay for it. And, the downside of that is we don't get as much airtime. We're not as out there in the world as The Guardian is or the Mail is, and it's harder for us to compete with people like BuzzFeed and Vice. But on the other hand, it does give us a new revenue stream that allows us to invest in the journalism that we value and think is important. So everything has changed, and we're all still struggling to adapt. It's a scary old world out there for us. But when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, it's all changing. The waves haven't landed us on the beach yet. Will there be a future for newspapers? I thought there's one thing that makes me optimistic about newspapers, and that is that in essence, what we do hasn't changed. The things that make a difference, what makes a difference, what we do that makes a difference hasn't changed. So if I go back to what I was talking about very early on, the long and illustrious history of the Times, back to 1854, the first and greatest of the war correspondents was William Howard Russell, and he was sent by the Times to cover the war in the Crimea. And his eyewitness reports of the Battle of Balaclava were eventually immortalised in the poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson, in The Charge of the Light Brigade. But more importantly than that, his very humane and compassionate reports, and they're worth reading, they're wonderful, which appeared in the Times against all the odds, not least the military high-ups who really wanted to have nothing to do with him, eventually brought down the government and led to reforms of the army. Now, if you fast forward to last year, if we think of Rotherham in Yorkshire and my colleague Andrew Norfolk, who over the course of several years doggedly uncovered the sex grooming scandals that were going on in Rotherham, scandals in which young girls were being groomed for sex, but where the authorities, the very people that were in place and were supposed to be protecting them, namely social services, the police, the local authority, all knew about it and all turned a blind eye and all refused to respond to early reports that this was going on. Andrew tackled this over several years, and eventually the reports that he published in the Times led to a complete overhaul of the council, led to an independent inquiry, and led to the truth finally coming out. He took a light, he shone it where the authorities didn't want him to shine it, and as a result, change came about. Now, they're very different examples. One was a war in a foreign country, one was wrongdoing in our own backyard. But in essence, they amounted to the same thing. It was the Fourth Estate shining a light on something that was wrong and change coming about as a result. And the interesting thing, I think, for journalism and why I think there's a future is even if we don't know how we're going to deliver it, or indeed how we're going to fund it, we're still very clear about what the purpose of journalism is. And for that reason, I'm optimistic. And I just hope I'm right.
Hey, 1967 was the year of the Enoch Powell speech, or was that early 1968? 1967. 1968, the Beatles released the White Album, which was known as the Beatles album is what it was called, but it was called the White Album, and a lot of people will tell you today that that was mainly because it had a white cover. What they won't tell you is that in context with that time, the words black and white were never more associated with race in the 20th century, 1965, 1967. The album came out in 1968. So that it was called the White Album was not an accident. And you could not call it the White Album in 1968 and not think about race. The year that Martin Luther King was killed, the year that the Beatles released the album, just before Enoch Powell released the Rivers of Blood speech, looking across to America and the change that he saw happening there and the anger of the black Americans, which was not as replicated in the black British. So race was right at the heart of who we are. It was a summer of love if you were white, and it was a summer of hate if you were black. And that great sort of concert, which was by the other guys, who's the Beatles first, and then it's by the Rolling Stones. One man was killed by the Hells Angels. Nobody tells us that that one man was a black man that was killed, and it was because of race that it happened, because he was outside of their narrative. He was a symbol, a physical symbol of change. I'll tell you what, folks, I grew up in a village in Lancashire. I was the only black in the village. So I came from the town and I went to the city, and as I got to the city, I met lots of men and women who'd come from the village as well, and they'd gone to university, and they were the first to say that they didn't have a problem with race because there were no black people in their villages. And they would go on to be social workers, lawyers, doctors, academics, carrying that narrative that they did not have an issue with race. I want to share something with you. It's a very simple idea. I can tell more about the humanity of one of my Lancashire streets when somebody moves into that street who doesn't speak the same language as the rest of the people on the street. That will tell me more about who everybody really is on that street than if they were all the same. I will know more about integrity. I will know more about personality. Because when somebody doesn't speak your language, you read, if you just look, you read how they're looking. You read the context of where you are. And do you know how easy it is to kind of get what they're talking about? Whether they're happy, whether they're sad. The words that we speak give away only a small percentage of what we mean often. Our full body is talking, and I know I'm being kind of performative here, but actually, as a rule, we can kind of contextualize for a person when they're speaking to us. This allows us to understand people better. It's greater for communication. And anyway, sorry, what I was saying was that for me, racism and the lack of being able to communicate with people who do not communicate in the same way of you is a great portal to see a person, to clearly see them. A lot of people say to me, oh, no, I'm not racist, but you don't want to meet my granddad. That's ageist. That is absolutely ageist. You don't grow into a racist. It's there in the beginning when you didn't speak to that person who was on that street of yours. And when they didn't reply to you in the way that you wanted them to reply to you, you didn't, by default, take offense. Because when you do take offense, that says more to me about you than it does about them. The whole idea that Nigel Farage is talking about, I didn't know I was going to say this. I've changed while I was sat there. I changed. I had a series of things to talk about, and I changed. Because that whole idea that he's on a train being offended by people, I've never spoken about him in public. It's not really, it's all good, it's all good. But the whole idea that there's a problem with people speaking a different language on the train that you're on is just so alien to me. I say alien. Because that to me would be a great celebration of a way of like, well, how can I understand them and not understand their words? How can I do that? When a baby is crawling across your front room, you're not like, well, she's not speaking our language, is she? She comes over here with a crying. You give to it. Brings out the human in you. I did it today when I got on this train, and this little baby started smiling at me, and I smiled at him, and his mother said, please go away. She didn't, actually. She just didn't, and he did it again and again until I just thought he was weird. The point is, I don't know what the point is number one, in the 1960s, there was a great concert at the Royal Albert Hall, which was organised by Michael Horowitz, and it was the Poetry Olympics. Whenever there is great change and revolution, there are poets, always. It's happened in the Arab Spring. It happened in the 60s. And I know a lot of those poets. I performed with many of them from Ted. Did Ted Hughes do that gig? He did. Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, the Liverpool poets, all of them. Not all of them, lots of them. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. That's happening now. Poets are rocking it now. Unfortunately, slam poetry has taken the teeth out of them. But that's another story. Where was I? We are migratory by nature. When I was born, I migrated from the womb into the open air. I migrated from village to village. Learning is a kind of migration. We are constantly in the state of migration. Do you remember when you went from your village to the city? It was a different world. Do you remember when you changed from teen to adult? It's a new world, from child to teen. A new world. We are constantly... Remember when you let your kids go and you thought of migration and nature and the hurt it filled in you when you saw their wings growing? We are migrants. It's our word. It's our word. Migration is part of who we are. It's unnatural to think of it as unnatural. And I believe that one day... Sorry, I give a man a stage. I'm going to... I am Chancellor of the University of Manchester, and I was installed yesterday. And it was a long ceremony. Never tell people what you're doing because everybody's got children and everybody's worked really hard. I'll tell you one more thing before I go, other than the fact that change is part of who we are, in that we are constantly in states of migration, and to pretend that that's not the case is to kind of fool ourselves. And it's one of the privileges of change to think that it's not happening. And what was I going to say to you? I was going to say to you that I blog and I tweet and I Facebook. I have no family as a child. It's a story. And the point is that I blog just to prove that I exist at any given point in time. If I'm ever in a newspaper, it's proof that I exist at any given point in time. And all family is a group of people proving that each other exists over a lifetime, which is why when you're 45 and you go home and your mum says, "Have you washed your socks?" It's not about the socks. It's about showing you that there's a point of relativity that you belong to. And I never had that. And from the age of 18, I've always known that a published, my name in a newspaper was proof that I was there, because that's all family is doing. All family is a collection of disputed memories between one group of people over a lifetime. And I knew very early on that I had nobody to dispute the memory of me of, and that if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, and I was that tree and nobody did, and I'm talking about no mother, father, sister, brothers, aunts and uncles, nobody, cousins from childhood. So I blog and I tweet, and I know that that's a kind of relativity that I have. And that's an incredible thing. Sorry, folks, that thing that I said about the street earlier on, we are in the process of change. We are in a revolution right now that is similar to the 60s. And if you don't know it now, you'll look back and regret that. This is it. The revolution is happening now. More people are communicating with each other ideas and of change now than ever before since the beginning of time. That is what the internet has done. The revolution is now. You are now part of it. It is happening. And the poets are there, to me, as proof. That's it. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, fantastic, all of you. I'm going to throw it open to you guys now. Remember, there are a couple of microphones roving about, and you need to speak into the microphone, partly for the benefit of everybody in this hall, but also for the live streaming audience. So remember to wait until you get to the microphone. Just as you're thinking of your first question, let me ask the first one, just to get us talking again. So I'm going to pick up with what you were saying there, Lem. Let's go back to the 1960s, right?
Yes.
You say now.
Yes.
2015, moment of potentiality, moment of threat and danger, but still you talk about the power of journalism, absolutely. But if we go back to the 1960s, Julie talked about Martin Luther King coming here and talking about with great optimism that the world was going to change. Sam Cooke as well, a change is going to come.
Yeah.
Bob Dylan, the times they are changing. That was a moment of change. I mean, do we share that optimism now? That same level of optimism that Martin Luther King and those writers, those songwriters had? Or do you feel more pessimistic? Perhaps the whole idea of change is now a little bit more distant to us, or if change is seen as something which is going to happen, we're more worried, I guess this is what you were saying, David, in part, about the downsides, the unintended consequences of that as well. So I just wondered if you wanted to speak about that, whether we're still as optimistic as change as we were, 50 years ago?
May I say just something? Because I know I've just spoken a lot.
Do.
Because I'm buzzing a bit, so which is what happens when you speak. But it's the 50th anniversary of the Race Relations Act. A black guy just won the Booker Prize. Jackie Kay is the Vice-Chancellor the Chancellor of Salford University. I've just become the Chancellor of Manchester University. Things are changing. And I think the biggest change is not to do with race. I think it's to do with gender. I think that's where the exciting stuff is happening.
So for you, this is a moment, anything in it, just like the 60s, we're right in the middle of it now.
And I think gender is the thing. This is two men talking right across me.
Thank you. I don't feel that kind of enormous sense of optimism. I'm not in touch with the kind of student movement that really thinks that peace is going to come. There isn't a war that I think is going to be stopped by the engagement of the young middle classes, which is, I imagine, what happened in America. But I am incredibly excited by the internet and what you were saying about the possibility of this communication tool. For me, having been reading all my life, the fact that I can sit in my Yorkshire farmhouse and read a book which is actually in Harvard Library just seems to me to be an absolute miracle. I mean, it is like magic. And not just Harvard Library, but any library, almost anywhere in the world, anything that's been digitized, and almost everything has, I can either read it on my screen then and there, or I can order it in a moment. I mean, that, as a scholar, that's nothing like that. And then you go, yes, and what do people do with this fantastic communications tool? They use it to look at pictures of kittens. And you go, yes, because that's a bit of our nature, is that we're really, really stupid. And we're not going to change that. We've actually got to go, yes, we are really people who love pictures of kittens. And also, some of us waste our time looking up books.
Well, I was going to say, I think some of the optimism around the digital revolution, which I'm still very optimistic about, the gloss has gone off it a bit, because I think when it first came along, we had very high expectations. There was the Green Revolution in Iran that was all done on Twitter. It was going to allow citizens to go over the heads of despotic regimes. It was going to bring about positive change. But it does feel to me like some of that gloss has gone off it, because yes, we all look at kittens. I don't mind kittens, but I don't like conspiracy theories, which go mad on the internet. And I don't like trolls, of which there are too many. A lot of people are withdrawing now from the internet because they simply don't like the responses they get. Now, I think ultimately it will overcome those negative forces, but it feels a little bit at the moment like we don't really know what to do with the digital revolution. Where exactly is it taking us?
I was just wondering what Martin Luther King would make his key issues if he were here today. I mean, he'd say that institutional racism, formal racism, legal racism isn't an issue with the end of apartheid, Jim Crow, all of those things are around the world. But individual racism, interpersonal racism may still be a problem. He'd probably be talking not about poverty, but about inequality now. That poverty still exists within societies, even though fewer people are in absolute poverty on a global scale than were 50 years ago. And if he were talking about war, he wouldn't be talking about war between countries. He'd be talking about war within countries. Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, the move has changed there. And he'd be talking about climate change, I think, as well. The realization that human beings are not apart from nature, but a part of nature, can have changed it and can change it, positively and negatively. I'm kind of pes-optimistic. That's my favorite word. We're on a knife edge here. We have to change. It's our job to change.
So there's a question just here, please.
Hi. What interests me most is the fact that I've changed a lot in my lifetime. Things have changed outside my life, but I've changed a lot. A lot of the skills and a lot of the rubbish I was when I was younger, 18-year-old me, I wouldn't have recognised me now. Can I ask the panel, can they look back when they were 18, we'll take it for an arbitrary figure, and would they recognise themselves now? Thank you.
Thank you. So who wants to go first? Would you recognise your younger selves?
I was a girl, so that's true.
I can recover my entire younger self on YouTube now. I can watch everything I watched at the age of 12.
Yeah.
It's terrible, but it's addictive to go back there. 10 years ago, you couldn't do that. You can relive your teenage years. It's all there.
I think that I find as I get older that I recognise myself more and more, so I am more like a younger person, not 18, because by the time I was 18 I was full of nonsense. But the sort of the vision of the things that I thought were important when I was about 7 to 10, they seem to me to be very present to me now. And those experiences seem to me to be very vivid now. The things that I was really interested in then are probably the things that I do a lot of today. I was very, very keen on animals, and I loved being in the country, and I loved reading. And probably that sort of purity which you have when you're a child before you get completely muddled up. But by the time I was 18, I genuinely thought that success would lie if I married somebody wealthy.
Right.
And it didn't.
You tried.
I had to earn my own living, and you know, thank God for it. But by the time I was 18, I was completely confused about what I was and what the world was. It's taken me this long to get back to the simplicity of being 7.
Well, I absolutely recognise the person I was at 18, and I keep waiting for the moment at which I'm going to not recognise that person anymore, but it hasn't happened yet.
There's a question just here.
Question for the panel. I've been studying the Northumberland coal industry, and I sort of fell over the French Revolution. And I find that I was fascinated by your point about the poets, because that was a time of change if there ever was one. The French were revolting and getting excited about fraternity, equality, property. The German romantic philosophers, from Kant to Marx, were thinking great thoughts, and we had the romantic poets. Now, Wordsworth invented gardening when he went and wrote about flowers. Byron went and died romantically in Greece. And the poorest of them all, Keats, he died romantically of consumption because he couldn't afford, he had to write about the Grecian urn and about a beaker of the warm south rather than actually going and trying it out. So who made the greatest contribution to change?
Of those 3?
Yeah. No, well, please yourself.
Oh. That's a great question. But I can't
Can't possibly answer it.
Yeah, I can't answer it.
You didn't mention Shelley, poets, the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I think Len would
yes.
sign on to that.
Yes.
Poet of the Peterloo Massacre. He probably changed the world more.
I met
politically.
Death along the way, and his name was Castlereagh.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Shelley. Which is like not answering the question.
I can't answer that. I just don't know enough about poetry, sorry.
I'm deferring to the historian. Beautiful.
Well, let's throw in Mary
Beautiful.
Wollstonecraft, a poet of the mind, if not just on the page.
Or William Blake, or there's plenty more.
William Blake,
yes.
absolutely.
Interesting. I mean, we're talking here about poets as the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Do you feel, poets, writers, historians, journalists, I mean, do you really feel that you are agents of change, that you are changing the world through what you do, that the arts and the humanities are agents of change? Or do you see yourselves more on that kind of as the interpreters, as the people who are understanding and communicating it?
I feel very strongly that it's possible to hold up a mirror and say, this is like this. Particularly in historical fiction, I think it's possible to say, for instance, almost all my novels are about women, in a sense, trying to define how they want to be, how they want the world to be. And because I mostly write in the Tudor and medieval period, they're in a time of the most extreme patriarchy. So I think, in a way, when I write about that and modern women read it, that I'm saying this is probably the worst it's ever been for women, and yet women get an education, and yet women fight for themselves, and yet women find the courage and the power to survive, and sometimes to be successful in a military way, or successful in a political way, or successful in religion, or successful in their own lives. So I think, for me as a writer, I wouldn't ever dream of doing more than saying, here is a slightly curved mirror. It's a reflection of how I see the times. It's not necessarily, I'm writing historical fiction, it's not necessarily absolutely as they were, and you might not agree with me, but I want you to think of that period and think of your own.
When I was 18, you couldn't mention that you're in care, you know, and I don't know what I'm saying, except for there are things that I want to change regarding the care system and creativity and linking the two. I've said it before, but Superman was a foster child, you know, Batman was orphaned, Moses, who is real, but Moses was adopted, Jesus really was a two-parent family, Muhammad, it's true, to Muhammad, peace be upon him, you know, he was fostered by his grandparents, Elizabeth Salander from The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Oliver Twist was in children's homes, David Copperfield, there's Jane Eyre, we're in all of the popular culture, and yet most of us here would not make the link between them being in care and the kid in the street, or, God forbid, the children's home at the bottom of the street. People don't make a connection between the two. Within my lifetime, they will. And that's a game changer in how we see the child in care in our society. One of the reasons that they've been extricated from us, or that we've separated them from our own experience, is quite simply because they are a living, breathing proof that the system cannot work, a family. So anthropologically speaking, it's very bad for us to acknowledge them as a fully functioning form within our society. But I think that within my lifetime that's going to happen through the creatives. The children's writers were there first. Philip Pullman, not Jackie Wilson. She's not the first one to do the children's homes. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, it's in... And when we make that connection as a society, so change will happen. I don't know what the question was.
Well, I think you're answering it, which is you're saying that writing leads to change. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah. Not only that,
it
is a... I think there is something about what Philippa's doing that is a seer. I think that's in writers, novelists specifically.
Okay. There was a question over here, two questions over here.
I was curious to ask, I can think of examples myself, but I won't weary you with them. Have there been moments in each of your lives as you've sort of moved along a timeline and you think about your own biography? These could be political moments, cultural moments, whatever. Have there been moments where you thought, something's happened that's tipped me into a different context, and now I need to rethink the world that I now find myself in?
Oh, wow.
Profound.
We're back to spots of time and romantic poetry.
Beautiful question, though.
I can answer it.
You're good would be to a moment of time.
No, I think age 16, very happy but bored at my local school, and I got a letter telling me that I had a scholarship to go and study in New Mexico for 2 years. I didn't even know where New Mexico was. Got out an atlas, and my dad said, you can't go there. There are gorillas there. I said, what do you mean there are gorillas? Do you mean gorillas or guerrillas? And he said, guerrillas. We knew nothing about it. Anyway, I stood my ground, and it totally changed my life. Having said that, I don't think I'd have had a bad life if I'd stayed put. But being catapulted into such a totally different environment at the age of 16 was very dramatic.
Meeting one great teacher at school when I was about 10 years old. He had the measure of me at that point, and my school report said something like, not very enterprising, won't go very far, but stuck with me years later. He introduced me to ideas, he introduced me to the importance of history, he introduced me to music, introduced me to lots of parts of Europe I never knew anything about, long before I visited them. He changed my life, that one great teacher. I mean, I say this now because he passed away 2 weeks ago. Very, very important person for me and everybody else who passed through his classroom. So just to put in a bid for that, great teachers. Great teachers change lives almost more than anyone else you can imagine. I'm sure we've all had that experience right here.
Yeah, thanks. Beautiful.
Yes, my formative experience was a great teacher as well. I was at Sussex University and I was going to read English literature. And in those days at Sussex, you had to take a multidisciplinary, you had to take another humanities course. And I went to history because my friend was going to history. And I didn't think I'd like it, but my friend was going, so I went too. And Maurice Hutt, French Revolution historian, came into the room and threw a glass ashtray across the room, and it slammed into the wall. And we were all first years, and we went, oh God, he's mad. And something terrible was going to happen. And he said, what did you observe? And we went like, we don't know. And he picked up the other ashtray and threw it to the other wall. And we go, oh God, now he's breaking things. And he said, what did you observe? And we went like, well, that one broke and that one didn't. He said, yes, history does not repeat itself.
Oh, beautiful.
Now clean up.
And then I wanted to read history, please.
Yes, the change of context. I spent most of my adult life searching for my family, pouring all of my own resources and my just into finding them all over the world. And I found them all over the world. What I didn't know is that the most profound change of experience was that the biggest thing that I was near to finding was myself, and that after finding them all, I had to let them go, and I had to let go, and that I was never expecting that. I always thought you find your family and then you grow with your family, and I didn't realise part of the central experience of being part of a family is actually letting them go, whether you've been with them all of your life or whether you've spent all of your life searching for them. And that was it's changed my whole outlook on things as well. Also, just one more thing, is it's not a black and white issue, race. I realised as I travelled and I found my family around the world, and as I extended my life throughout the world, that racism is learned behaviour in every society that I've been to. That's, yeah.
There's a question just here at the back.
One of the big changes in society is the way that we use technology to eliminate people we think who threaten us. And I'm thinking of the two young men that suffered by the drones. And we flew, I think, 300 drones last year from this country. So I'm interested in how the humanities, the novelists and the media helps us think through that ethically and morally.
Is this something you can answer, Emma?
Well, I think you're talking about the case of the two British-born men that were out in Syria who were killed extraterritorially. Those two. Is that who you're talking about?
Well, that's just one example of hacking.
With drones.
Well,
yes.
the phones were hacked,
Yeah.
so they could fire the drone.
The drones weren't hacked.
Talking more generally
No.
about using technology just to eliminate those we think. And I was speaking about it broadly because we use that weaponry. It's a new configuration of war. The technology is being used as that. Of course, we don't need the army. But I'm asking broadly, how do the humanities help us think through ethically and morally how to think about that? How do we think about that change ethically and morally? That's my question.
Well, all I can say is we wrote a leader the next day saying that it was ethically wrong to have done what happened. No state should have the power to just decide they can go overseas and kill citizens just like that without any sort of parliamentary procedure.
I mean, the Times is the Times. Does it still have that kind of influence? Did people in, let's say, Whitehall read that? Do you think that morning, over their toast and cornflakes, and think about what they'd done?
I'm sure they did, and only last week I got last week we put the story about Michael Gove and Saudi Arabia on our front page. That story had been being written about by a blogger who blogs for the Financial Times for months, and nobody had taken any notice of it. But we took the decision, I can't remember why, I think because one of our columnists had written a column about the fact that Michael Gove had gone to war with Hammond over this contract with Saudi Arabian prisons. We took the decision to lift it out and put it on the front page. And gratifyingly, the next day, they withdrew the contract. I don't think we have the influence we used to have, but it is fair to say that I think putting something on the front page of the Times, it still means something. And certainly in this instance, it did.
Can I take us back 2,000 years to answer this question? This is, I hope, the power of the humanities. Cicero, the great Roman orator, statesman, philosopher, wrote a long letter to his son just before Cicero died. And in that he said, human beings have circles of duty and connection to each other. Closest circle is your family, next circle out is your countrymen, furthest circle out is humanity as a whole. What technology has done is scramble all of that. Everybody far away in humanity is now very close. That makes us feel, to see immediately those kinds of deaths and to feel a connection. At the same time, it distances us. Technology is cold. It makes it somehow easier for those who are sitting in windowless offices, in military bases in the United States, manipulating drones tens of thousands of miles away, to distance their actions or have their actions distanced from themselves as the drones go into action. There's an amazing play whose name's escaping me about the psychological impact of that warfare on the drone pilots themselves, and how utterly ethically wrenching and destructive that kind of technological distancing turns out to be for them. Technology brings everything closer, pushes everything away, scrambles these ethical boundaries, but should be bringing us closer, bringing that ethical circle of the whole of humanity ever closer inward to us, as we feel every death as something, as if it's in our family, our human family.
So, a question just here, please.
I remember as a teenager reading a science fiction story, and it really appalled me and shook me up terribly. And it was of this world in the future where people would sit in front of a machine. They wouldn't even need to leave home. They could order their food, they could communicate with other people, they could just be in their own little cell. And I remember thinking, this is terrible, this is horrifying. I must work to see that this never ever happens. And of course, the horror is that I'm living in that world. And my question to you is really about the tyranny of choice. We are just little animals, and we're bombarded. Like you say, the drones, or we hear about horrible things in, Rwanda or Syria, but, how compassionate can we be? Does it dilute our compassion? And I feel bombarded by information. I can get it from so many sources, but I almost feel like I'm losing my ability to think. And just as a final note, I remember going to the Soviet Union many years ago and talking to dissidents there, and they said, well, they can't stop us from reading and sitting around the kitchen table discussing and thinking. And you'd sit with these people and you think, they really do think. And I wonder if, just like we can't write long, complicated letters anymore, are we becoming shallower and not really thinking and losing a degree of wisdom?
This is like an episode of Tomorrow's People. Because you're actually saying that out loud.
What do you mean?
That's really scary. Because that means we're already there. We're already in that space, And my only, my God, this is it. That's that. It's there. We're there. My only, I read books. Writers will always write. Painters will always paint. And they'll translate the experience of our spirits and our aspirations in ways that we could not have predicted, that we couldn't get out of a machine, and that will always be thus. So art will, poets, writers, historians, translators of time, as you said, of the past and the future, even predictors, seers. That we become. You, that creative spirit in you, that's what you're fighting for when you read a book. To be opened, to find what you didn't know you were looking for. You know, we need more of that as we start to become commoditized. I don't even know if that's a word, but...
Oh, it is.
Shall we make it? It is a word, yeah.
Philippa.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious myself of being powerfully affected by visual images of hardship and war. And so I look after my imagination, since it provides me my pension. My imagination and my consciousness is as important to me as, say, my car. Like, it gets me places I need to go. And I look after it like it was a child. So I protect it from too damaging images. I protect it from too much material. I do take out time. I have a friend who has a reading day, and she doesn't answer her phone, and she doesn't do anything electronic on that day. She just reads books and thinks. And I think in the world that we live in, which is both gives us such opportunities for so much more leisure, if you have the wisdom to have a vacuum cleaner and not spend as much time vacuuming as your mother would have had to have done sweeping, which of course nobody's ever done. Every time people invent a labour-saving device, we just do more. So if you drop your standards back to, say, Victorian cleanliness and do it with a vacuum cleaner, then you have at least a day extra a week. That we have to use these tools to give us the time to be human. And humans can't take an absolute barrage and assault of information. We have to filter it. We have to make sure that we put filters in our lives, not just on our machines.
Lovely.
I'm living evidence of the Victorian era. I'm probably the only person in this room, I'm betting, who has never had a cell phone and never wants a cell phone. So trying to work against that. And still I survive somehow in this modern world. The more serious point is we have choices about the future. The great science fiction writer, if you're a science fiction reader, you probably know William Gibson. He has this marvelous line: the future is all around us, but it's unevenly distributed. So you choose. It's your choice. Choice is tragic and it's overwhelming, but we're all here to choose. We're not stuck in the past. We're not condemned by the past. We can make our choices. That's how change happens.
Okay, I see so many hands, I'm afraid. We're running out of time. We've got about 5 minutes more. Now, there was a question over here for some time. I think it was you, sir, in a kind of green jumper.
There was reference at the beginning of this evening to the alternative cultural opportunities that are available to us this evening. And that was a reminder of how much Newcastle has changed. For 20 years now, probably, culture's been a major part of our economy. And if you look around the city now, you'll see a lot going on, and a lot of it's being driven by our two universities, if I'm allowed to allude to the other place. But I'd like to ask about a lot of the changes that aren't taking place in the wider Northeast. If you look at yesterday, the national unemployment figures were announced, and they'd come down by 79,000. But here in the Northeast, uniquely, apart from Scotland, they'd gone up. And for as long as I can remember, the Northeast has been at the bottom of all those league tables: employment, health, educational attainment, that measure human flourishing. And it still is. And that doesn't seem to be changing. So my question is, what can people in the humanities do to try and bring about the change that should be happening but isn't?
We can do one thing that you just did, probably consciously. Use the term human flourishing. That's Aristotle. That's his eudaimonia. It's not saying GDP, gross domestic product, the bottom line. It's talking about human flourishing. What do human beings need? What capacities, capabilities, necessities do they need to flourish as human beings? That's from the humanities, and that's having a major impact among behavioral economists and others who are taking those kinds of measures and saying, what do people really need to lead good lives? It's not just the economics. So that's a big step forward, just to change the ideas, change the frame.
I mean, you know, it's not really for me to say, but if there is hope, it does perhaps lie with culture and the arts in this particular region of Britain. Newcastle is bidding to become this European city of innovation, and that will be based around our cultural innovation, no longer around our shipbuilding or our coal mining. So there is perhaps hope.
I was at the say it's the fault of Henry Tudor. It really is. You know, you had a Council of the North, you had a Kingdom of the North, you had a Palace of the North in Sheriff Hutton. Richard III would have looked after the Northeast. And it's all gone to hell since then. And, you know, until we get the Plantagenets back, ideally based in York, it'll all go wrong.
Okay, we're going to have one... What I'm going to do is ask, perhaps there are so many hands now, I'm just going to ask perhaps 3 people to ask their questions simultaneously. Well, not simultaneously, but very rapidly, one after another, and then we'll just kind of pick them off, one by one. So you had a question just right there at the back, and then Lorna has a question just here.
The internet's been a big theme throughout this evening, and also historical hindsight was mentioned. So I was going to ask, is there any event, historical event, that you can see as an equal one to the internet in terms of how much change happening so quickly?
Good question. And here?
Okay, I wanted to ask what the panel would say to people who don't have the tyranny of choice, to people who don't have access to the internet, to people who don't have access to the outside world, to the media. I've just read an account of somebody escaping from North Korea over the Chinese border and having to be repeatedly raped by traffickers. And they're living in a world that is absolutely millions of miles away from some of this debate. And I just wondered what you would say to her, stuck without enough to eat and no access to media or internet.
2 important questions, and there's just one here at the front as well. We'll have this one, and then we'll see what we can do. Mark.
Thanks. I guess I want to ask that question almost the other way around. What, from your personal lives or in the abstract, what is it that makes you able to ride with change or to influence change? That is, how do we flourish in the face of change?
Wow. 5 seconds each to address each of those.
I would answer that last question. I think enjoy not just your own children, but enjoy all children. I think I've got lots of children in my life, and they're all wonderful. I don't buy this idea that kids today, this, that, and the other, they're great. And I go into lots of schools as well to talk, and I always come out inspired by how interested and interesting the kids are. So if you want to stay optimistic about the world, stay in touch with young people.
I'd like to do the internet one. The question about the internet, what in the past was on a par with this? I'm sure there's things in classical history which I don't know about at all. But the Gutenberg Bible and the printing, the explosion of printing, which meant that you could get a book which hadn't been handwritten and painted by an individual, which took years. All of a sudden, you could get printed books and they went worldwide, and that was so extraordinary in terms that it spread literacy, it spread ideas, and it put books in the hands of women because they became cheaper as well. So I would say that the internet is on a par with that explosion of knowledge.
I agree.
A really tricky one.
Okay, David.
1569, the first Spanish galleon going from Mexico to Manila, the beginnings of globalization, linking the great economic powerhouse of the world, China, to the emerging empires of Europe. It's a long-term, slow-burning change, but it's the one that creates the world on top of which the internet now sits, and that's opening up the world to mutual influences, breaking down the past, the different futures, and bringing them into dialogue with each other from the very beginning.
For me, it's when I was a kid, we had very hot summers in the 1970s, and it was the invention of the jubbly. The jubbly was like this triangle-like thing, and it was a game changer for me as a kid.
Well, we haven't perhaps answered your question about that very fundamental question about North Korea and other places, but we have run out of time, I'm afraid. Would you like to?
I'd like...
No, do.
We can't leave that one, can we?
Go ahead.
I know, okay.
Well, I just can't think about what an
Well, but
answer.
we do things within our own personal capacity. I mean, you do what you can within your own thing. You do gardens for Gambia,
North Korea?
Well, no, I'm saying that there may not be a way of helping the person in North Korea. Sorry, you know, six form student said to me, "Don't point." This is years ago. She went, "Do that," but it just takes it all out of it. This is great. Anyway, you do what you can do in your capacity. If every single person does something that helps somebody else from another part of the world, let's say, then that problem will start to reduce. I know that sounds really general, but actually that can make a difference. The action is everything. That is where the revolution is, by the way. It's in what you said before. You said you choose your future. And I'm not saying that particular person won't still be harmed, but I am saying that the more of us that do something, the better we are. And we do things.
I mean, we have all talked about the power of the word, the written word, to change things, whether it's journalism, whether it's poetry, whether it's fiction, whether it's change.org, and it doesn't just change the single reader, it changes the world as people's attitudes gradually change over time. There is, surely, that's what we do. This is the power of the arts and humanities to affect change. It may happen only very slowly, but it happens inevitably. Now, we don't know whether that change will be good or whether it will be bad, but there is going to be change. Just let me finish then by introducing you to my imaginary genie, who is coming in right at the end here just to close proceedings, and that genie is going to allow you the one wish to change just one thing. What is the thing that you most want to change right now? Who's going to go first?
I will.
Good.
Corruption. I think it's at the root of so many of our problems today, and I wish it could be eliminated.
Beautiful.
And I think we forget and we underestimate how lucky we are to live in a country with such stable institutions. Whatever you think of the politics, we live in a stable country where the institutions, by and large, work and are held to account. And I think, if only other countries could enjoy that, a lot of the world's problems would go away.
It's gone. It's gone. Corruption's gone.
All right. I'm in
Philippa.
this.
I like this.
I was frightened of being too glib, but if you're going to abolish it, then
Is it emoticons again?
emoticons, and also I'd really like you to get rid of that sort of cruelty which we see just in so many places, which just comes from people's inability to imagine what it is like for the person to whom you are behaving like that. So I wish we could all have a massive compulsory empathy implant. And then you wouldn't behead people. So do that.
Can I do
You want to go next?
Yes. Go ahead. I'd like there to be less automated things in shops. Because I think that because I think that communication is a really key and undervalued thing, and because what's happening in shops is happening to teaching, where the value of the teacher is being crushed by the statistics that they have to kind of achieve, and it's their unique contact with the student which makes the magic happen within the student.
An unexpected item in the teaching area. That's what you want to get rid of. Yeah.
I want to get rid of that process.
The undervaluing of teaching and an end to the unequal access to teaching, not just within countries but around the world. And then immediately, I want to change the fact I don't have a drink in my hand. Can we manage that?
I'm so sorry, I haven't been very All right, we're going to leave on that note. Now, I am going to tell you that there is a table outside, and there are some authors here, and they would be very happy, I think, to sign any books that you wish to purchase from them. There's a bookstore just outside. But I need to finish by thanking the panellists. That's been fantastic. Thanking the Arts and Humanities Research Council for their support of this event, and thanking you all for coming and for your questions. Thank you very much indeed.